Apple just lost one of the most important lawsuits in its history, a case that will cost them billions. But the strange part is this: they didn't lose to a government, they didn't lose to regulators, they lost to a video game company, and somehow that was only the beginning of their problems. For years, Apple looked untouchable, the most valuable company on earth, a stock that only seemed to go up, a brand people trusted without question. But lately, cracks have started to show. Since late 2024, Apple's stock has fallen sharply, hundreds of billions in market value wiped away, making Apple the weakest performer among the so-called Magnificent Seven. So what happened? Because Apple didn't suddenly forget how to build iPhones. They didn't lose their design talent overnight. What they lost was control. This story really begins in August 2020. And strangely enough, inside Fortnite, Epic Games quietly pushed an update to the iOS version of Fortnite. Nothing flashy, no announcement. But buried inside was something Apple never allowed: a direct payment option outside the App Store with a 20% discount. Apple reacted immediately. Fortnite was removed from the App Store within hours, and Epic Games was ready. The same day Fortnite was banned, Epic filed a lawsuit. Not weeks later, not months later, that same day. Because this wasn't an accident, it was a trap. To understand why this mattered so much, you need to understand Apple's business model. Apple takes a cut from every purchase made inside iOS apps: paid apps, subscriptions, in-app purchases. For most developers, that cut is 30%. For smaller developers, 15%. And Apple made one rule very clear: you could not even mention other ways to pay. No links, no buttons, no text. If you wanted access to iOS users, you paid Apple. This is why subscriptions were often more expensive on iPhone than anywhere else. This is why Spotify refused to sell subscriptions inside the app. And this is why developers hated the system. But nobody could challenge it until Epic Games decided to. Epic wasn't small. Fortnite was printing money, skins, battle passes, crossovers with Marvel, Star Wars, DC, anime, musicians, athletes. Every purchase on iOS meant Apple took nearly a third for simply hosting the app. Epic's founder, Tim Sweeney, had been criticizing Apple for years, calling it a monopoly, calling the App Store a closed system. So Epic prepared for war. Internally, it was called Project Liberty. Millions spent on lawyers, millions on public relations. They knew Apple would ban Fortnite. That was the point. In 2021, the first ruling came in. Apple wasn't declared a monopoly, but the court did rule that Apple violated California's unfair competition laws. Apple was ordered to stop blocking developers from telling users about other payment options. Apple appealed, then appealed again, then took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in early 2024, Apple lost. The injunction stood. Apple was forced to comply. But they didn't comply honestly. Instead, Apple introduced what many called malicious compliance. Yes, developers could link to external payments. But Apple added a new fee, a 27% commission, plus processing fees, almost the same as before. And that wasn't even the worst part. Apple added warning screens, full-page messages telling users they were leaving Apple's secure environment. Even if the link went to Spotify, or Netflix, or Epic Games, Apple didn't mind you clicking links in email apps, or browsers, only when money was involved. That's when Apple suddenly cared about your safety. The case went back to court, and this time, the judge didn't hold back. Judge Yvonne Gonzalez-Rogers ruled that Apple had deliberately undermined the court order. She stated Apple's commission had nothing to do with intellectual property value, that it existed purely to preserve revenue. Then came the bombshell. Apple's vice president of finance, Alex Roman, was accused of lying under oath. Internal documents showed Apple planned the 27% fee long before they claimed. The judge referred the case for possible criminal contempt proceedings. Her words were clear: this is an injunction, not a negotiation. Apple had lost completely. Within days, the App Store rules changed. Spotify added external payment links. Patreon followed. Stripe published guides for developers. And Fortnite returned to iOS. For consumers, this was a massive win. Lower prices, more choice, less control. For Apple, it was a financial disaster. But this lawsuit was only one front in a much bigger war. Because Apple's real problem isn't Epic Games, it's China. Over 95% of Apple's products are still assembled there. Over 1,600 factories. Millions of workers tied directly or indirectly to Apple. For years, this was Apple's greatest advantage. Cheap labor, fast production, unmatched efficiency. But the world changed. Labor costs in China doubled over the last decade. Younger workers don't want factory jobs, and local brands like Huawei caught up in quality, while undercutting Apple on price. By 2024, Apple had dropped to third place in China's smartphone market. iPhone sales fell sharply, the biggest decline in years. Then came geopolitics, trade wars, tariffs, restrictions. U.S. import taxes on Chinese goods surged. This time, Apple didn't get exemptions. Every iPhone assembled in China became more expensive overnight. Apple began scrambling. Their solution? India. By 2024, about 14% of iPhones were made there, an impressive shift, but nowhere near enough. Experts estimate it could take a decade for India to match China's scale and efficiency. And until then, Apple is stuck. Add to that stagnating iPhone upgrades, a messy rollout of Apple Intelligence, regulatory pressure in the US and Europe, and suddenly Apple looks vulnerable. Not because they're failing, but because they pushed their power too far. The App Store, the fees, the control. For years, Apple believed no one could stop them. Epic Games proved otherwise. And now, every regulator, competitor, and government is watching closely. Apple didn't lose because of one lawsuit. They lost because they refused to adapt. And this time, there may be no easy fix. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.